Family Guy has been on television for more than 25 years, canceled twice, brought back from the dead, and gone on to outlast almost every animated show that competed with it. It has also spent a significant portion of those years in trouble. One episode about abortion was finished, packaged, and ready to air, then quietly placed in a drawer where it has stayed ever since, never broadcast on a single American network. One episode was pulled from every streaming platform within 24 hours of a national tragedy. One episode about domestic violence generated enough backlash that the production remade it entirely and retired the original from circulation. And underneath all of that, running through every season, are mysteries the writers introduced and walked away from, lore built carefully and then abandoned, and questions about Quahog that have never been answered. Tonight this video walks slowly through all of it. Welcome to Red Umbrella. If long, calm breakdowns like this are something you enjoy, the subscribe button helps the channel a lot. The episode that never aired in America. There is a specific kind of quiet that surrounds a piece of media when the people who made it decide it should not exist in the usual way. Not destroyed, not disowned, just withheld. Placed somewhere off to the side where technically anyone can find it, but where it will never appear in a normal television broadcast, never show up in a streaming library, never run in syndication at 2 in the morning on a cable channel most people have forgotten they have. That quiet is a very deliberate kind of silence. And for one Family Guy episode, that silence has lasted more than 15 years and is still going. The episode is called Partial Terms of Endearment. It was produced as part of Season 8. The writing was completed. The animation was completed. The voice recording was completed. Every technical stage of production that an episode of Family Guy goes through before it reaches an audience was finished. The episode exists. It has always existed. And yet, it has never aired on Fox. It has never aired on Adult Swim. It has never aired in syndication on any American network. It is not available on Hulu. It is not available on Disney Plus, which carries every other episode of the show. In the United States, the only legal way to watch Partial Terms of Endearment is to purchase a standalone DVD release that came out in September 2010, or to find it through Amazon in a Family Guy specials package. That is the extent of its American presence. A finished television episode from a show that has been airing continuously for more than 2 decades, that has effectively been placed in a drawer and left there. To understand why, you have to understand what the episode is about. And to understand that, it helps to know a little about how Family Guy typically handles difficult subjects. The show's default mode is irreverence. It approaches almost everything through the lens of shock comedy, cutaway gags, and the willingness to treat nearly any topic as material for a joke. That has always been the show's identity, and it has gotten Family Guy into trouble repeatedly over the years. But Partial Terms of Endearment is different from the episodes that earned controversy through that approach. What makes it unusual is that it does not fully lean into irreverence. It attempts something closer to a genuine engagement with a genuinely difficult subject, and that paradoxically is part of what made Fox so reluctant to put it on television. The episode begins with Lois running into an old college friend named Naomi. Naomi and her husband have been trying to have a child, but Naomi has been unable to conceive on her own. She asks Lois to become a surrogate mother. Lois is reluctant at first, and Peter is firmly opposed, but Lois eventually agrees, undergoes in vitro fertilization, and becomes pregnant on Naomi and her husband's behalf. Then, while Lois is carrying the pregnancy, Naomi and her husband are killed in a car accident. The biological parents are gone. The fetus remains. And Lois and Peter are left with a decision that the show does not allow them to avoid, that the writing does not let them sidestep with a joke, and that the episode takes seriously enough to let both sides of it breathe. Peter, after being approached by anti-abortion activists and shown a video designed to change his mind, becomes strongly opposed to terminating the pregnancy. Argues with Lois. He makes his case. The episode gives his position room to exist without turning him into a pure punchline, which for a Family Guy character whose entire comedic identity is built on being wrong is genuinely unusual. Lois, meanwhile, moves through the episode's central conflict with a seriousness the show rarely applies to her. She is not simply the straight man reacting to Peter's chaos. She is someone genuinely wrestling with an impossible situation. At the end of the episode, the family sits down, and Lois, after apparently reconsidering everything, begins to explain why carrying the pregnancy to term makes sense. The family listens, and then Peter quickly interrupts to tell the audience that she still got the abortion. The show restores the status quo, as it always does. But it does it with enough self-awareness to signal that it understood what it was doing throughout. The episode does not deliver a clear moral position. It does not tell the audience what to think. It presents both sides of one of the most politically and culturally divisive debates in American life, lets them exist in the same half hour, and ends without picking a winner. That, according to Fox, was the problem. When the episode was completed and reviewed by network executives, the decision not to air fair, it was made relatively quickly. Fox Entertainment president Kevin Reilly addressed the decision publicly, and his explanation was striking in its candor. He did not say the episode was badly made. He did not say it was offensive. He acknowledged that the subject matter had been, in his words, handled well. What he said was that abortion is the most fragile of all hot-button issues, and that at the economic and cultural moment when the episode was produced, broadcasting it was simply not worth the risk. He framed the decision explicitly as a financial calculation rather than a moral one. The episode was not pulled because it was wrong. It was pulled because it was risky, and the potential for advertiser backlash, viewer complaints, and the kind of sustained controversy that costs a network money in real and measurable ways was not something Fox was willing to absorb. Seth MacFarlane's response to the ban was characteristically direct. He called the episode too edgy for the network, which was a notable admission given the range of content Family Guy had already put on television at that point. The show had aired jokes about AIDS, about child abuse, about racial stereotypes, about sexual violence treated as comedy. All of that had made it through the broadcast process. An episode that took abortion seriously and presented both sides without a punchline resolution was the thing that did not. What followed the Fox decision was a long and quiet journey for the episode through various release formats. It was shown in the United Kingdom on BBC Three in June 2010, and in Australia, though both broadcasts came with edits for time and content. In the United States, the DVD release arrived in September 2010 and gave the episode its only domestic audience. The IGN review upon that release gave it a 7 out of 10 and noted that the controversy around the ban was somewhat overstated given how closely the episode matched the show's usual style. DVD Talk observed that the satire in the episode was aimed primarily at pro-life activism, though it stopped short of making that into a fully developed argument. The episode received a brief mention in the Family Guy retrospective special 200 episodes later, which acknowledged its existence without dwelling on the circumstances of its absence. In the syndication packages that distribute Family Guy episodes to other networks, the slot that would have been filled by Partial Terms of Endearment is instead occupied by a clip show called Family Guy Live in Quahog, which assembles musical numbers from past episodes. It is a placeholder, a gap where an episode should be. As of the time this essay was written, the situation has not changed. Partial Terms of Endearment remains unavailable on every major American streaming platform. Disney Plus, which hosts every other episode of Family Guy, including some that would strike many viewers as considerably more offensive than a nuanced treatment of abortion, does not carry it. Hulu, which carries the rest of the series in uncensored form, does not carry it. The episode exists in a category by itself. It is the only Family Guy episode that has never aired on American television in any form, not pulled after airing, never aired at all. There is something worth sitting with in the specific shape of that decision. Family Guy was, at the time Partial Terms of Endearment was produced, one of the most reliably controversial programs on American television. It had been canceled twice and survived both cancellations through DVD sales and cable reruns. It had run jokes about subjects that genuinely caused harm to real communities. It had depicted violence, sexual content, racial caricature, and religious mockery in ways that generated complaints, boycotts, and sustained critical disapproval. And the one episode that Fox decided was too dangerous to broadcast was not the most offensive one. It was one of the most careful ones. One of the rare episodes that tried to treat a difficult subject with something approaching genuine seriousness. The ban was not about content. It was about the subject itself. Abortion in American broadcast television was not a topic that could be engaged with at all, regardless of how thoughtfully the engagement was handled. That distinction matters. It tells you something about how American television has historically functioned as a cultural space, and about the specific pressures that shape what gets made, what gets aired, and what gets quietly placed on a shelf and left there. Family Guy managed to put almost everything on television over the course of its run. The one thing it could not put there was a story that asked an audience to think carefully about one of the most contested questions in American public life without telling them what answer to arrive at. The episode is still out there. It can still be purchased. In other countries, it aired with relatively little fanfare. But in the country that made it, for the network that produced it, Partial Terms of Endearment remains exactly where it has been since it was finished, complete, unseen, and waiting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of the one episode that never made it to American television is a particular kind of ban, clean, and total from the beginning. But the next story is different. It is about an episode that aired normally, existed on streaming platforms for years, and then was pulled in less than 24 hours because of something that happened a month after it first broadcast, something the show had nothing to do with, but could not escape the shadow of once it began. Section 2, the That Got Family Guy Sued. Before there was an episode of Family Guy that Fox refused to broadcast entirely, there was an episode that Fox simply held back for years, not quite willing to kill it, and not quite willing to air it, sitting in a kind of institutional purgatory while the show itself went through cancellation, revival, and the complicated process of figuring out what it was allowed to be. That episode is When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and its history contains enough distinct layers of controversy, legal trouble, and institutional nervousness that it could fill an essay on its own. It is a story about a network that got scared, a song that ended up in federal court, and an episode that spent more time waiting to be seen than it spent being made. To understand how the episode ended up where it did, it helps to understand the specific moment in which it was written and produced. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was made in 2000 during Family Guy's original broadcast run, intended to air as the final episode of the second season. The show at that point was still finding its audience. It had launched in January 1999 with a 2-episode premiere that drew reasonable numbers, and it had carved out a space for itself as a show willing to go further than most animated comedies on network television. But Fox had never been entirely at ease with it. There were ongoing conversations between the production and the network about content, about what was acceptable, about where the line was, and whether the show kept crossing it. Family Guy was not yet the institution it would eventually become. It was a newer program trying to establish itself on a network that sometimes seemed unsure whether it wanted that establishment to succeed. The episode's premise is constructed around a stereotype, and that construction is deliberate. The writing room was not unaware that the material they were working with was sensitive. The entire premise of the episode is that Peter Griffin, having been defrauded by a con artist selling volcano insurance in coastal Rhode Island, needs help recovering his money, and his friends Quagmire and Cleveland suggest he seek out a Jewish lawyer or accountant. The suggestion operates entirely on the cultural assumption that Jewish people are categorically better at financial management than others. Peter accepts this premise without hesitation and without irony, because Peter accepts nearly everything without hesitation and without irony. That is the foundational joke of his existence. He is a man for whom the distance between a received idea and a held belief is essentially zero. What the episode is doing with that premise is filtering it through a character whose entire comedic identity is built on being wrong. Peter Griffin is not a reliable narrator of anything. When he believes something, the show has established across its entire run that the belief is almost certainly misguided, incomplete, or based on a misunderstanding so fundamental that correcting it would require more work than the situation is worth. The episode is structured so that Peter's embrace of a Jewish stereotype leads him through a series of experiences that are meant to expose the stereotype as the simplification it is, even as Peter himself never grasps that lesson. He befriends Max Weinstein, a Jewish accountant whose car breaks down conveniently in front of the Griffin home. Max helps Peter recover the money he lost. Peter comes away from the experience not with any greater understanding of Jewish people as individuals, but with the reinforced conviction that the stereotype was correct and that he should convert his son, Chris, to Judaism, so that Chris can benefit from the same imagined financial aptitude. Peter arranges a bar mitzvah for Chris without Chris's informed consent, convinced this is an act of genuine parental investment in his son's future. Lois eventually arrives to stop the ceremony. The episode ends with all three, Peter, Lois, and Chris, escaping through a window and boarding the back of a bus, a scene deliberately constructed to mirror the famous ending of the 1967 film The Graduate. That specific reference is worth noting because The Graduate is a film about a young man who has no idea what he is doing and stumbles into a dramatic gesture that he immediately recognizes the moment it is completed, as having no clear outcome. The parallel to Peter's situation is not subtle. The episode also contains a musical number, and that musical number is where the legal and institutional trouble begins. Peter, overwhelmed by his desire to locate a Jewish person who can help him navigate his financial problems, performs a song. The song is called I Need a Jew. The melody is taken directly from When You Wish Upon a Star, the song from Walt Disney's 1940 animated film Pinocchio. The original song, composed by Lee Harline with lyrics by Ned Washington, is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of American animation. It is gentle and aspirational and carries a great deal of cultural weight as a piece of childhood memory for generations of American viewers. The Family Guy version keeps the melody intact and replaces the lyrics entirely with Peter's earnest, embarrassing, deeply uninformed attempt to articulate what he is looking for. The song functions as a joke about Peter's ignorance first and about Jewish stereotypes second. One specific lyric became the center of Fox's concern. In the original version of the song, Peter, while expressing his admiration for Jewish people, includes a line referencing the historical Christian accusation that Jewish people were responsible for the the death of Jesus. The line is sung by Peter Griffin. Peter Griffin, a character the show has spent multiple seasons establishing as someone who misunderstands his own Catholic faith, regularly demonstrates ignorance about basic religious concepts and cannot be trusted to hold any theological position with any degree of coherence. Seth MacFarlane's defense of the line was precise and consistent. Consider the source. The joke is not that the accusation is true or acceptable. The joke is that Peter believes it and simultaneously claims to admire and need Jewish people, which is a portrait of a very specific kind of contradiction that exists in how some people hold prejudice and affection at the same time without recognizing the tension between them. Fox executives did not find that framing sufficient protection. When the completed episode was reviewed before its scheduled broadcast in 2000, the decision was made not to air it. The network's stated concern was that the episode's reliance on Jewish stereotypes as its primary comedic material might be read by a segment of the audience as endorsement rather than satire. The fear was that viewers who did not understand or accept the show's ironic register would receive the episode's premise at face value, which would mean receiving the premise that Jewish people are better with money as a straight claim rather than as an object of gentle mockery through the prism of Peter's foolishness. That concern reflects something real about how comedy operates and how differently it can land depending on who is watching and what framework they bring to it. Satire requires a viewer to understand that they are watching satire, and that understanding is never guaranteed. A joke built around a stereotype, even one structured to expose the stereotype as a stereotype, can function as a simple delivery mechanism for the stereotype if the satirical layer is not visible to the person receiving it. Fox's concern was not irrational, but the decision it led to, holding back a completed episode for years, was an unusually strong institutional response to a risk that, as it turned out, the episode's eventual reception did not justify. The show was canceled by Fox in 2002, before When You Wish Upon a Weinstein had ever aired. The episode went with it into the canceled period, sitting in the archive of a program that was no longer in production, associated with a network that had declined to broadcast it even when the show was running. For approximately 3 years, the episode existed in a state of near total suspension. It had been made. It had been rejected. The show it belonged to had been ended. There was no clear path for it to reach an audience. The revival changed everything. Family Guy's return from cancellation is one of the more documented stories in American animated television, and it is covered in more detail later in this essay. The short version is that DVD sales of the canceled seasons were significantly higher than Fox had anticipated, and Adult Swim reruns were drawing consistent audiences that demonstrated the show had retained and expanded its viewer base even while it was off the air. Fox renewed the show for a 4th season beginning in 2005. As part of that renewal, previously unaired material became relevant again. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein premiered on Adult Swim on November 9, 2003, which was before the show had officially returned to Fox, but during the period when Adult Swim was actively running reruns and building audience momentum for the revival. The Adult Swim broadcast used a modified version of the contested lyrics. Seth MacFarlane had recorded an alternate line replacing the reference to the killing of Jesus with a softer, more neutral phrasing that preserved the song's structure while removing the specific element that had caused the most concern. That alternate version became the standard for all subsequent television broadcasts. Fox aired the episode on December 10, 2004, using the same modified lyric. The original lyric, the one recorded first and included on the DVD release, became a minor artifact of the episode's complicated journey. One of the more curious details of its broadcast history involves the closed captioning on some television airings. The captions, which are generated separately from the audio track, sometimes display the original lyric while the audio plays the replacement version. A viewer watching with captions on would see one line while hearing another. The original words, the ones that caused Fox to hold the episode for years, are visible as text on the screen even as the officially approved replacement plays over them. It is an accidental documentary record of the compromise embedded in the episode's broadcast history, a seam in the finished product where the two versions of the song briefly overlap. Fox's eventual airing of the episode produced considerably less controversy than the network had spent years fearing. Critics who reviewed it upon release noted that the episode was less inflammatory than its reputation implied. Some found it unremarkable by Family Guy's standards, which was its own kind of commentary. The stereotyping in the premise was obvious, but it was obviously filtered through Peter's established unreliability. Viewers who watched the show regularly had the context to understand what the episode was doing. The catastrophic advertiser backlash and viewer complaint campaigns that Fox had worried about did not materialize in any significant way. The legal trouble, however, was still ahead. In 2007, 3 years after the episode finally aired on Fox, a lawsuit was filed. The plaintiff was Born Co., the music publishing company that holds the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star. The suit was filed against Fox and the creators and producers of Family Guy. The central argument was that I Need a Jew was not a legitimate parody protected by fair use, but rather an infringement that used the melody of a copyrighted song without proper authorization and in a way that damaged the reputation of the original work by associating it with offensive content. Born Co. described the parody as a thinly veiled copy rather than a genuine satirical engagement with the original. The fair use question in copyright law is genuinely complicated and has been litigated extensively in American courts across a wide range of creative contexts. The relevant standard for parody requires that the new work comment on or criticize the original work it is borrowing from, rather than simply using the original as a convenient vehicle for unrelated jokes. Born Co.'s argument was essentially that I Need a Jew did not comment on When You Wish Upon a Star in any meaningful way, but simply borrowed its melody because the melody was recognizable and emotionally effective. Fox and Family Guy's legal team argued the opposite, that the parody was clearly protected, that the use of the original song's melody was integral to the satirical effect of the Family Guy version, and that the association of an innocent aspirational melody with Peter Griffin's embarrassing search for a Jewish acquaintance was itself a form of commentary on the gap between the idealized world the original song inhabits and the messy, prejudice-shaped reality that Peter inhabits. The case moved through the federal court system over approximately 2 years. In 2009, the court found in favor of Fox and Family Guy. The parody qualified as protected expression under fair use. Born Co.'s argument that the reputational damage to the original song was a sufficient basis for the lawsuit did not prevail. The song remained in the episode. The lawsuit ended. What the full arc of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein illustrates, across all of its stages, is the layered system of pressures that operates around a show like Family Guy. The creative team produces material. The network reviews it and makes decisions about what can air and when. Those decisions are shaped by assessments of financial risk, advertiser sensitivity, and anticipated audience response. The assessments are sometimes wrong. The episode that Fox held for years because it feared anti-Semitism accusations aired without generating the response that had been feared. The legal challenge that came 3 years later was resolved in the show's favor. The delay cost the episode 3 years of its potential broadcast life and coincided with the show's entire canceled period. None of that delay was the result of any actual harm the episode caused. It was the result of predicted harm that did not arrive. There is also a detail about the episode's title that became unexpectedly significant many years after the episode was made. The surname Weinstein was chosen in 2000 as a common Jewish surname, selected for its recognizability and its phonetic fit with the title's structure. It was not a reference to any specific individual. When the Harvey Weinstein scandal became international news in 2017, the episode's title took on an association that had nothing to do with its original meaning. The show addressed this in a later episode with a brief acknowledgement of the coincidence. But the title was not changed, and the episode was not renamed. It remained exactly what it had always been, a piece of 2000 Family Guy with a name that time had made strange. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein spent years in delay and eventually reached its audience with less damage than anyone expected. The next story moves faster and hits harder. An episode aired, a national tragedy happened 30 days later, and within 24 hours the episode had been removed from every platform that carried it. What followed involved a fabricated video clip, a conspiracy theorist with a large platform, and a question that has never fully been answered about what a cartoon is responsible for when the world outside it catches up to something it put on screen. Section 3. The marathon episode and the fake clip that changed everything. There is a particular kind of trouble that arrives not from what a show intended, but from what the world decides to do with it afterward. Family Guy has been in trouble for things it chose to put on screen. It has been in trouble for jokes that crossed lines the network drew or that audiences drew for themselves. But the story of Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon bombings of April 2013 is a different kind of trouble entirely. It is a story about an episode that aired normally, generated its usual share of mild criticism, and then found itself at the center of one of the more genuinely disturbing media controversies the show has ever been part of. Not because of what the episode contained, but because of what someone else built out of pieces of it after a tragedy happened. To follow the story properly, the episode itself needs to be understood first. Turban Cowboy is the 15th episode of Family Guy's 11th season. It aired on Fox on March 17, 2013. The episode begins with Peter Griffin going skydiving having a parachute malfunction, and surviving his landing by falling onto a person below him. He ends up in the hospital, where he befriends a man named Mahmoud, who is Muslim. Peter, in the way that Peter tends to approach any new experience, becomes intensely enthusiastic about Mahmoud's faith and converts to Islam with the kind of overnight conviction that he brings to every interest he adopts before immediately moving on from it. His friends Quagmire and Joe become suspicious of Mahmoud as Peter's behavior grows increasingly strange, and as details about Mahmoud's activities begin to raise questions. The episode contains a cutaway gag, which is one of Family Guy's most frequently used structural devices, in which Peter wins the Boston Marathon. The method by which he wins it is that he drives his car through the race course, running over runners as he goes. Peter wins by default because everyone else in the marathon has been knocked down by his car. The gag is shot and played in the show's standard cutaway style. It is dark, it is brief, and it is the kind of joke that Family Guy had been making about violence as an absurdist punchline for years. Bob Costas, voicing himself, appears in the cutaway to ask Peter how he managed to win the marathon. Peter's response is that he just drove, and that when there was someone in his way, he dealt with them. The gag then ends, and the episode continues. Separately, later in the episode, the plot involving Mahmoud reaches its conclusion. It turns out that Mahmoud is indeed planning a terrorist attack, which means the episode's anti-Islamophobia message, carried through Brian's objections to Quagmire and Joe's suspicions, is undercut entirely by the twist. Brian had spent the episode arguing that Mahmoud was being unfairly profiled, and that Joe and Quagmire's concerns were rooted in prejudice rather than evidence. The episode ends by proving Joe and Quagmire right. Peter, having been given a cell phone by Mahmoud as a gift, dials the number and accidentally detonates a bomb that destroys a bridge. The detonation happens off camera. What the viewer hears is an explosion and screaming. The episode ends. That is the actual content of Turban Cowboy as it aired on March 17, 2013. The Boston Marathon gag and the bomb detonation are two separate scenes, operating in separate parts of the episode, with no narrative connection between them. One is a brief cutaway joke with no relationship to the episode's plot. The other is the episode's climactic story beat. They share no geography, no causal link, and no thematic relationship beyond existing in the same 30 minutes of television. The Boston Marathon bombings occurred on April 15, 2013, 29 days after Turban Cowboy first aired. 2 pressure cooker bombs were detonated near the finish line of the race. 3 people were killed and hundreds were injured, many severely. It was one of the most significant domestic attacks in the United States since September 11, 2001, and it generated immediate and sustained national attention. In the hours and days that followed, people were looking at everything connected to the Boston Marathon through an entirely different lens than they had 24 hours before. Someone whose identity was never definitively established in the public record took 2 clips from Turban Cowboy and edited them together. The first clip was the cutaway showing Peter at the Boston Marathon, driving through the crowd of runners. The second clip was the scene of Peter dialing the cell phone and the subsequent explosion. In the actual episode, these 2 scenes are separated by a substantial portion of the episode's runtime and have no connection to each other. In the edited clip, they were placed back to back, making it appear as though Peter had driven through the Boston Marathon and then detonated bombs at the finish line, directly predicting, or perhaps in some readings inspiring, the attack that had just occurred. The edited clip spread rapidly across the internet. It was convincing enough to people who had not seen the actual episode, or who were not paying close enough attention to notice that the 2 scenes had different settings and different surrounding context, to be received as a genuine piece of footage showing Family Guy predicting the Boston Marathon bombing. The emotional environment in which the clip was spreading, the immediate aftermath of a real attack that had killed and maimed real people at a real marathon, made critical evaluation of the clip significantly harder than it would have been under normal circumstances. People were frightened and angry and looking for patterns, and the clip offered what appeared to be a pattern. The person most responsible for amplifying the edited clip was Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist and radio host who operated the InfoWars platform. Jones posted the clip on his website and on social media, framing it as evidence that Family Guy had somehow predicted or been connected to the bombing. Jones had a significant audience, and the clip reached a very large number of people through his platform in a short period of time. YouTube marked some versions of the clip and related discussion videos as potentially offensive or inappropriate, which slowed but did not stop the spread. Seth MacFarlane responded publicly and quickly. He posted on Twitter calling the edited clip abhorrent. He was precise in his language. He described the attack as a crime and a tragedy, and stated clearly that his thoughts were with the victims. He did not attempt to defend the episode's content or to argue that the cutaway gag about the Boston Marathon was appropriate given what had happened. He separated himself from the edited clip explicitly, identifying it as a fabrication designed to create a connection between the show and the attack that did not exist. Other members of the Family Guy production team, including Seth Green, retweeted MacFarlane's statement in visible solidarity with his position. Fox acted the same day that MacFarlane posted his response. The network confirmed to multiple outlets that Turban Cowboy had been removed from Fox.com, from Hulu, and from Amazon. A Fox representative stated that the network had no immediate plans to air the episode again. The removal was total across the digital platforms Fox controlled. The episode was gone from American streaming within 24 hours of the bombing, which means it was gone within 24 hours of the edited clip, beginning its rapid spread online. The speed of that removal is worth considering for a moment. Fox had held When You Wish Upon a Weinstein for 3 years before deciding it was safe enough to air. The network had declined to broadcast Partial Terms of Endearment entirely. Both of those decisions were made before any public controversy had materialized, based on anticipated risk. The removal of Turban Cowboy happened in real time, in response to an actual event, and it happened faster than almost any institutional media decision of comparable significance. Whatever process normally governs how Fox manages its content library was compressed to a matter of hours in this case, because the alternative was allowing an episode with a Boston Marathon gag to remain publicly available the day after 3 people died at the Boston Marathon. The journalistic and critical response in the days following the removal was relatively consistent in its assessment of the edited clip. Multiple outlets, including The Week and others that analyzed the footage carefully, pointed out that the connection between the two scenes was fabricated. The clip was a hoax. The show had not predicted the bombing. The show had made a joke about the Boston Marathon that, in isolation and out of context, would have been a fairly standard piece of Family Guy dark comedy with no particular connection to anything. The bombing made that joke impossible to watch without a completely different frame of reference, but that was a function of timing and tragedy, not of any genuine foreknowledge or inspiration. The episode's actual content was also reviewed more carefully in the aftermath. Critics noted that Turban Cowboy was not a strong episode by Family Guy standards, the AV. Club reviewer Kevin MacFarlane gave it a D grade and observed that the episode felt as though it had been written in 2002 and left on a shelf for a decade, completely unaware of how its handling of Muslim characters and terrorism had aged. The episode's anti-Islamophobia message, delivered through Brian, was effectively nullified by the reveal that Mahmoud was in fact a terrorist, which meant the episode managed to be both heavy-handed in its attempt to critique prejudice and ultimately validating of the prejudice it claimed to critique. That critical assessment had nothing to do with the bombing. It was a judgment about the episode's quality and coherence as television. Turban Cowboy remained off American streaming platforms for approximately 9 years. It was eventually returned to Hulu in September 2022, quietly and without announcement or statement from Fox or the show's production. By that point, nearly a decade had passed since the bombing. The episode had been available in other countries and through other means for years, and its return to the American streaming library generated almost no attention. It simply reappeared. What Turban Cowboy leaves behind as a case study is a question about the relationship between comedy and catastrophe, and specifically about what a piece of comedy becomes when a real event reshapes the context around it. The Boston Marathon gag in Turban Cowboy was not made with any awareness of what would happen at the actual marathon a month later. The writers could not have known. The connection was accidental, a piece of dark comedy about a famous race that became unwatchable when that race became the site of a real attack. The edited clip that circulated online was a hoax, and that hoax was identified and corrected relatively quickly by responsible media coverage. But the episode was still gone for 9 years. The joke still existed. The real event still existed. And for a long time, those two things could not share a platform. Seth MacFarlane's personal connection to mass casualty events adds a layer to the Turban Cowboy story that is impossible to ignore entirely, and that becomes the central subject of a later section in this essay. MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 on September 11, 2001. He missed that flight by 10 minutes. The show he went on to make contained jokes about September 11, about Osama bin Laden, and eventually entire episodes in which Stewie and Brian have to ensure that September 11 happens, because preventing it makes everything worse. That episode aired in 2011, exactly 10 years after the attack. It generated its own wave of controversy, which is examined in detail later. The point here is that MacFarlane had a direct and personal relationship with the consequences of mass violence in American public spaces, and the show he made reflected that relationship in complicated and sometimes uncomfortable ways. Turban Cowboy is the most most direct collision between that tendency and reality. A show that had been making jokes about violence at American public events for years happened to air a joke about the Boston Marathon 1 month before the Boston Marathon was attacked. The joke did not predict the attack. The edited clip that implied otherwise was a fabrication. The episode was pulled anyway, because there was no version of keeping it available that did not feel wrong given what had happened. And for 9 years, that calculation held. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Turban Cowboy disappeared because of what happened outside the show. The next episode disappeared because of what happened inside it, specifically because of how it handled something real and painful and got nearly everything about it wrong. Section 4. The domestic violence episode that went wrong there is a version of Family Guy that tries to be serious. It does not happen often, and when it does, the results are mixed enough that the show seems to learn from each attempt and recalibrate before trying again. Brian and Stewie, the bottle episode from season 8 where the two characters are locked in a bank vault together for an entire episode, is widely considered one of the show's most successful ventures into genuine emotional territory. It works because it stays small, because it trusts two characters with enough history between them to carry a story without jokes as a safety net, and because it does not try to deliver a message so much as simply let two people exist together in an uncomfortable space. That episode is held up regularly as evidence that Family Guy can do something other than shock comedy when it commits to the attempt. Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q is held up as evidence of what happens when the attempt fails. Not partially fails, not misses by a small margin. Fails in a way that generated significant backlash from critics, from domestic violence advocacy organizations, from viewers who watched it expecting Family Guy and received something that could not decide what it was trying to be, and from people directly affected by abuse who found the episode's treatment of their experience inaccurate, dismissive, and in some readings actively harmful. It is one of the most critically condemned episodes in the show's history, and the condemnation is specific enough to be worth examining carefully, because what went wrong with Screams of Silence is not simply that it was offensive. What went wrong is that it was trying to do something good and constructed it so badly that the attempt became its own kind of damage. The episode is the 4th episode of season 10, which aired on October 2, 2011. It was written by Alex Sulkin and directed by Dominic Bianchi. The premise originated from a running gag that had appeared in earlier episodes. Quagmire had a younger sister named Brenda who had appeared in passing references, and one of those references established that she was in a relationship with an abusive boyfriend named Jeff. The joke, in its original context, was a dark throwaway. Quagmire mentions his sister and her situation, and the show moves on. Someone in the writing room eventually decided that the throwaway had enough material in it to build a full episode around, and Screams of Silence was the result. The episode follows Brenda, voiced by Caitlin Olsen, as she arrives in Quahog with Jeff, her boyfriend, played by Ralph Garman. Jeff is abusive. This is established immediately and without ambiguity. Within the episode's opening minutes, Jeff hits Brenda because he does not understand a Jay Leno joke. He hits her in public. He hits her in front of other people. He is verbally aggressive, physically violent, and openly contemptuous of Brenda in situations where anyone watching can see exactly what is happening. Quagmire, Peter, and Joe observe Jeff's behavior and are disturbed by it. The episode's central narrative follows their attempts to convince Brenda to leave Jeff, and, when those attempts fail, their decision to take matters into their own hands. Before examining how the episode handles that narrative, it is worth pausing on the foundational problem that several critics and domestic violence experts identified immediately upon the episode's airing. The way Jeff is written and animated, as someone who commits violence openly and publicly, in front of witnesses, without apparent concern for being seen, is not how abusive relationships typically function in reality. Abuse in intimate relationships is almost universally characterized by a pattern in which the abuser presents a controlled, often charming face to the outside world while directing violence and control toward the victim in private. The public face is the facade. The private behavior is the truth. This is not an obscure point about the psychology of abuse. It is one of the most widely documented and discussed features of how abusive relationships operate, and it is central to why victims often struggle to be believed when they come forward, because the person others see publicly is not the person the victim experiences at home. Jeff in Screams of Silence does the opposite. He is openly, obviously, publicly abusive. He hits Brenda in front of everyone. He makes no effort to maintain a different public persona. Every person who encounters Jeff in the episode can see immediately that he is dangerous and violent. This means the episode cannot engage with one of the most important and painful realities of abuse, which is that the people around a victim often genuinely do not know what is happening, because the abuser has constructed a situation in which the abuse is invisible to outsiders. By making Jeff's abuse completely visible to everyone, the episode removes the most significant barrier that victims face when trying to get help or trying to be believed. It simplifies the situation into a version where everyone can see the problem clearly, and the only question is what to do about it. That simplification has consequences for everything else in the episode. Because Jeff's abuse is completely visible, the episode's treatment of why Brenda stays with him becomes the story's central moral and emotional question. And this is where Screams of Silence generates its most significant and most justified criticism. The episode repeatedly returns to the idea that Brenda is choosing to stay with Jeff, despite knowing what he is, and despite having people around her who want to help her leave. One of the episode's most widely cited lines has Brenda telling Lois that Jeff is sweet, and that she does not see how gently he hits her when they are alone. The line is written as dark comedy. It is delivered in a register that signals the viewer is supposed to find some grim humor in the gap between what Brenda says and what is actually happening. But the line also functions as a statement that Brenda is minimizing and rationalizing her abuse in a way that the episode frames as a personal failing, rather than as a recognized and extensively documented psychological response to trauma and coercive control. Victims of domestic abuse do minimize and rationalize. That is real. But the reasons they do so are complex, rooted in fear, in the psychological effects of sustained abuse, in economic dependency, in the disruption of their sense of reality that abusers deliberately engineer over time, and in a genuine terror of what might happen if they leave. None of that complexity is present in Screams of Silence. Brenda's decision to stay with Jeff is treated, through the episode's framing, as something closer to a failure of judgment than as a recognizable response to an impossible situation. The people around her, Quagmire, Peter, and Joe, are positioned as the episode's moral center. They can see clearly what is happening. Brenda cannot, or will not. And the episode's resolution does not involve Brenda developing the awareness or the resources or the support structure to leave Jeff on her own terms. It involves the men deciding to murder Jeff in the woods. Quagmire, Peter, and Joe take Jeff into the woods and kill him. Jeff is dead when the episode ends. Brenda is devastated. She mourns Jeff, which the episode treats as further evidence of how thoroughly she has been damaged by the relationship. Her grief for her abuser presented as a symptom of her victimhood, rather than as a human response to the death of someone she loved despite everything. The show does not give Brenda a moment of recognition or resolution or the beginning of healing. She is simply left broken over a body that the men in the episode decided needed to exist. The episode's moral conclusion is that the correct response to a woman's abusive relationship is for men to intervene on her behalf, physically eliminate the threat, and accept that she may not thank them for it. The woman at the center of the story does not get to participate in her own rescue. The critical response was swift and pointed. Kevin McFarland of the AV Club wrote that a serious episode of Family Guy cripples the show's strengths, which was a precise diagnosis of what the episode had attempted and failed. The observation was not simply that the subject matter was handled poorly. It was that the show had built its entire identity around a particular kind of comedy, a comedy that is fast and irreverent, and that treats everything as equally available for jokes, and that the attempt to pivot from that mode into genuine dramatic engagement with a serious subject exposed a gap between what the show was designed to do and what the episode was trying to do. The gap was too large. The tools Family Guy had developed for its usual mode were the wrong tools for what Screams of Silence was attempting. Other critics focused more specifically on the domestic violence content itself. Multiple outlets noted the inaccuracy of Jeff's open public violence as a representation of how abuse functions. International Business Times, reviewing the episode upon its original broadcast, described it as wholly inappropriate and noted that the victim was poked fun at in ways that made light of a deeply serious and difficult experience. The episode's use of Jeff's violence as a setup for jokes, the idea that his aggression is sometimes framed in ways designed to generate a darkly comedic response, sat uncomfortably alongside the episode's apparent intention to take the subject seriously. Domestic violence advocacy organizations and commentators were also critical, and their criticism was grounded in the practical concern that representations of abuse in popular media shape how audiences understand and respond to real situations. An episode watched by millions of people that presents abuse as something victims choose, and that frames intervention by outsiders as the appropriate resolution rather than victim empowerment and support, is not a neutral piece of entertainment. It is a piece of entertainment with a specific, if unintentional, argument embedded in it, and that argument is one that researchers and advocates have worked for decades to counter. The production's response to the backlash was unusual. In 2015, 2014, 3 years after the episode originally aired, a director's cut of Screams of Silence was broadcast. The director's cut made significant changes to the episode's content. Scenes that had shown Jeff being openly abusive in public in front of witnesses were removed and replaced with new scenes in which Jeff's behavior was more subtle and calculated. The revised version of Jeff was written as a two-faced character, someone who presented a controlled, even charming exterior to the people around Brenda while directing his violence toward her in private. This change addressed the most fundamental structural problem with the original episode. The Jeff in the director's cut was a recognizable portrait of how abusers actually operate rather than a cartoonish representation of open violence. The revised scenes also gave Jeff more personality and complexity, moving him from what critics had described as a one-dimensional strawman villain into something closer to a genuinely threatening and psychologically credible character. Fans who watched both versions generally preferred the director's cut. The changes made the episode's subject matter more accurate and made its emotional beats land with more weight, because the situation it was depicting was more closely aligned with how abusive relationships actually function. After the director's cut aired in 2014, the original version of Screams of Silence effectively disappeared from the official broadcast record. The director's cut replaced it in syndication packages. It replaced it on DVD re-releases of Season 9. It replaced it on TBS, on the FX networks, and in the episode's general circulation through the various channels that carry Family Guy content. The original broadcast version, the one that generated the controversy, became difficult to find through official means. It was not formally announced as replaced. It was not acknowledged as a corrected or revised version in any prominent way. It simply stopped being the version that aired. What remains when you look at the full arc of Screams of Silence is a picture of a show that reached for something it could not quite hold. The impulse behind the episode was not wrong. Domestic violence is a subject that affects an enormous number of people, and a show with Family Guy's reach addressing it directly could have done something meaningful. The execution failed because the show did not have the tools the subject required, and because the specific choices made in writing the episode about how Jeff operates and about what role Brenda plays in her own story undermined the episode's apparent intentions at almost every turn. The director's cut addressed some of those failures, but the original version had already aired to millions of viewers, and the image of Brenda that it created, a victim who is somehow choosing her situation in a way that frustrates the people around her, was already part of the show's record. The episode also carries a particular irony given the character at its center, Quagmire, the show's most prominent and enthusiastically portrayed sexual predator, a character whose entire comedic identity is built on the aggressive pursuit of women in ways that the show regularly treats as funny rather than harmful, is the moral center of Screams of Silence. He is the one most disturbed by Jeff's treatment of Brenda. He is the one who drives the decision to intervene. He is the one who delivers what the episode frames as its emotional core, a speech about what Brenda deserves and what Jeff has done to her. The episode asks the audience to invest in Quagmire's protective instincts toward his sister without engaging at all with the tension between those instincts and everything else the show has established about who Quagmire is. That tension is never acknowledged. The episode does not seem to notice it is there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Screams of Silence tried to say something real and built it on foundations that could not hold the weight. The next section moves away from a single episode and into a larger story, one that stretches across the show's entire history, and that begins not in a writer's room but at an airport gate in Boston on the morning of September 11, 2001. Section 5, the show that almost died and the man who almost wasn't there to save it. There are stories that sit underneath a television show's public history that never fully make it into the standard account of how that show came to exist and what it became. They are not hidden exactly. The information is available. People have talked about it. Articles have been written, but the story exists in pieces, scattered across interviews and retrospectives and casual mentions and profiles, and nobody has quite assembled all of it into the shape it actually makes when you put it together carefully. The story of Seth MacFarlane, American Airlines Flight 11, the 2 cancellations of Family Guy, and the specific way all of those things connect to each other and to the show's later treatment of violence, tragedy, and dark comedy is one of those stories. It is a story about a show that should not have survived and a man who should not have been alive to save it, and about what happens to the work a person makes when they carry that kind of weight inside the history of how they came to make it. Family Guy premiered on Fox on January 31, 1999. The pilot had been developed from a short film that Seth MacFarlane made while he was a student at the Rhode Island School of Design, a 7-minute piece called The Life of Larry, which introduced a bumbling middle-aged man and his anthropomorphic dog. McFarlane developed the concept further with a follow-up short, Larry and Steve, which aired on Cartoon Network. Fox saw the material and offered McFarlane a development deal. He was 24 years old when he was given the green light to develop what would become Family Guy. He was 25 when the show premiered. The deal he negotiated was worth approximately $2 million, which made him, at that point, the youngest person to have created and produced a primetime network animated series in American television history. The show's first season drew enough viewers to justify renewal. The second season continued. The third season began, and then the numbers started moving in the wrong direction. Fox had always been somewhat ambivalent about Family Guy, tolerating its controversies while watching its ratings fluctuate and making ongoing calculations about whether the show was worth the trouble it generated. By the end of the third season, the calculation came up negative. Fox canceled Family Guy in 2002. The cancellation was not treated as a major television event. The show had been struggling in the ratings, its time slot had moved multiple times, and its audience had not grown in the way the network had hoped. The cancellation was quiet, the show was gone. What happened next is the part of the story that gets told most often in accounts of the show's history, but it is worth going through slowly because the specific details matter. When Fox canceled Family Guy, the show's DVD releases were already in progress. The season 1 and 2 DVD set had been released, and it sold at a level that surprised virtually everyone involved. Animated television series on DVD were not expected to perform the way live-action dramas did. The format was considered a secondary market, something that existed to give completists a way to own episodes they had already watched. What actually happened with Family Guy's DVD sales was that they functioned as a discovery mechanism. People who had not watched the show during its original broadcast bought the DVDs, watched them, and became invested in a series that was no longer on the air. Adult Swim was the other critical component. Cartoon Network's late-night programming block had acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns, and those reruns were drawing audiences that were notably younger and more consistent than the show had attracted on Fox during its original run. A combination of DVD sales and cable reruns demonstrated to Fox in concrete, measurable terms that Family Guy had an audience that the network had not fully accessed during the show's original broadcast period. Fox brought the show back for a fourth season beginning in 2005, making Family Guy one of the very few canceled American television series to be successfully revived through a combination of home video performance and cable syndication rather than through any traditional network process. The revival is remarkable on its own terms, but it becomes significantly more remarkable when you understand what had happened in September 2001 between the cancellation that was coming and the survival that had not yet arrived. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to fly from Boston to Los Angeles on American Airlines Flight 11. He had been in Boston for professional reasons and needed to return to Los Angeles, where Family Guy was in production. His travel agent had given him the flight information, and according to MacFarlane's own account of what happened, the departure time on his itinerary was incorrect. His travel agent had told him the flight departed at 8:15 in the morning. The actual departure time was 7:45. MacFarlane had also spent the previous evening drinking and arrived at Boston Logan International Airport with a hangover. The combination of the incorrect departure time and the effects of the previous night meant that he arrived at the gate after the doors had been closed. He had missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes. He went to the airport lounge to wait for the next available flight. He fell asleep. When he woke up, approximately 45 minutes later, there was commotion around him. People were gathering around televisions. Something had happened. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked after a takeoff from Boston Logan International Airport and had been flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 in the morning. Everyone aboard the flight was killed. The flight that Seth MacFarlane had been booked on, the one he had missed by 10 minutes because his travel agent wrote down the wrong time and because he had stayed out too late the night before, was one of the 4 aircraft used in the September 11 attacks. MacFarlane has spoken about this publicly on multiple occasions, and his account is consistent across interviews. He has said that he does not view the near miss as a divine intervention or as a meaningful sign of any kind. He has described himself explicitly as not a religious person and has been careful to characterize what happened as a coincidence, a fortunate one for him personally, but a coincidence rather than something with deeper significance. The framing is deliberate and reflects something genuine about how he has processed the experience publicly, but the experience itself is almost impossible to fully bracket from the work he went on to make, because the work he went on to make repeatedly returned to September 11, to mass violence at American public events, to the question of what dark comedy owes to real tragedy and what it does not. Family Family Guy's relationship with September 11 as subject matter is complicated and spans many years of the show's run. One of the earliest examples is a gag in the Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island, which aired in 2000 before the attacks. That involved a joke connected to Osama bin Laden and an airport security context. The joke was removed from the DVD release of the episode after the attacks. The removal was quiet and was not announced by Fox. The original broadcast version contained the joke. The version that exists in the official home video and streaming release does not. It is a small edit, the kind that can pass unnoticed if you have only ever seen one version, but it represents exactly the kind of silent revision that the show's history is full of. Moments where something that existed was quietly made to not exist without formal acknowledgement. The more significant engagement with September 11 came in Season 10, with the episode Back to the Pilot, which aired on November 13, 2011, exactly 10 years and 2 months after the attacks. The episode uses Stewie's time machine to send Brian and Stewie back to the date of the show's pilot, January 31, 1999. While in the past, Brian, in a moment of impulsive generosity, tells his past self about the September 11 attacks so that his past self can warn the authorities and prevent them. When Brian and Stewie return to the present, they find that the attacks were indeed prevented, but the consequences of their prevention have reshaped American history in catastrophic ways. Because September 11 did not happen, the political conditions that followed it did not develop as they did in the real timeline. The episode's alternate history involves a second American Civil War and an East Coast that has been reduced to an irradiated wasteland. The episode's conclusion is that Brian and Stewie must go back and ensure that September 11 happens as it did in the original timeline. They must allow thousands of people to die because the alternative, a world where those deaths did not occur, is somehow worse. Stewie delivers a line that became one of the episode's most discussed moments, something to the effect that they had made September 11 happen, followed by an invitation to celebrate. The line was intended as self-referential dark comedy, the show acknowledging its own absurdity in having put its characters in the position of needing to cause the attacks. Many viewers and commentators did not receive it that way. The backlash when the episode aired, and again when it was rerun, was significant and sustained. MacFarlane's personal connection to the attacks hung over Back to the Pilot in a way that made the episode's existence particularly difficult to assess. The creator of the show had nearly been on one of the planes. He had spent the following decade making a show that returned to the subject repeatedly, treating it with the same irreverent darkness it applied to everything else. Whether that treatment was a way of processing something genuinely traumatic, or whether it was the show simply doing what the show always did and applying its standard approach to a subject that happened to be personally connected to its creator, is not entirely clear. MacFarlane has not offered a definitive account of how his experience shaped his willingness to use September 11 as comedy material. The interviews in which he discusses the near-miss focus primarily on the factual account of what happened and on his refusal to assign it cosmic significance. What is clear is that the show's survival and MacFarlane's survival were connected in ways that went beyond the obvious. Family Guy was canceled in 2002. It was revived in 2005. The 3 years between those two events were years in which the DVD market and cable syndication preserved an audience for a show that had been officially ended. That preservation was not guaranteed. If the DVD sales had been unremarkable, if Adult Swim had not acquired the reruns, or if the reruns had drawn weak numbers, the revival would not have happened. The show would have remained canceled. The episodes that followed, everything from Season 4 onward, would not exist. The show's engagement with September 11, with Turban Cowboy, with Back to the Pilot, with the Bin Laden airport gag that was quietly removed from the Season 2 DVD, none of it would exist. And MacFarlane's own survival was not guaranteed either. 10 minutes. A travel agent's mistake about a departure time. A hangover from the night before. Any one of those factors resolving differently, and the sequence changes. MacFarlane boards Flight 11. What happens to Family Guy in that scenario is genuinely unknowable. The show might have been continued by other hands. It might have been canceled regardless. The specific creative intelligence that drove the revival, that negotiated the DVD deals and managed the relationship with Fox and shaped the fourth season's direction, would not have been there to do any of it. The show that exists is the product of a series of contingencies so specific and so narrow that examining them closely creates a kind of vertigo. A hangover, a mistyped departure time, 10 minutes, and 3 years of DVD sales. That is, in compressed form, the survival story of one of the longest-running animated series in American television history. The man who made it should not have been there to make it. The show that carries his name should not have been there to carry it. Both of them survived, and both of them bear the marks of what it means to have survived in the particular way they did. Before we move move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That is the story of the controversies and bans that shape Family Guy's public record. Now, the essay moves into different territory. What follows is not about what the show was banned for, or pulled for, or sued over. It is about what the show built quietly inside itself, the lore it introduced and then abandoned, the questions it raised and never answered, the mysteries it left sitting in plain sight across 25 years of episodes. Section 6. The Villain Who Disappeared. There is a version of Stewie Griffin that most people who grew up watching Family Guy remember very clearly. He is small, he has a football-shaped head, and a British accent that the show never fully explains. He sits in a high chair at the Griffin family dinner table and plots. He builds weapons in his bedroom. He constructs elaborate devices designed to kill his mother. He delivers monologues about world domination with the kind of precise, unhurried confidence that suggests he has thought through every contingency and found them all manageable. He is, on paper, one of the stranger central characters in the history of American animated television. An infant with a genius-level intellect, a consuming desire to murder his own mother, and a detailed operational plan for taking control of the entire world. That version of Stewie Griffin was the character as he was originally conceived, the character who appeared in the pilot and drove much of the show's early identity, the character that made Family Guy feel genuinely unlike anything else on television at the time. That version of Stewie Griffin no longer exists. He was not written out of the show. He was not killed or replaced or formally retired in any episode that acknowledged what was happening. He simply dissolved, gradually and without announcement, across the course of several seasons, until the character who remained shared a name and a voice and a general outline with the original, but had shed the defining features of what made that original so distinctive. The world domination plans disappeared. The matricide plots disappeared. The weapons and the schemes and the cold, precise menace disappeared. What replaced them was something considerably more familiar and considerably less strange. A character defined primarily by his relationship with Brian, by a sexuality that the show hinted at but never confirmed, and by a wit that was sharp but no longer attached to any larger ambition. The transformation was total. It was never explained. To understand how significant that transformation is, it helps to go back to the beginning and look at what Stewie was actually doing in the show's early seasons. From the pilot onward, Stewie's storylines operated on a premise that the show presented as entirely literal. He was not imagining his plans. He was not playing pretend. The weapons in his bedroom were real. The time machine he built in season 1, constructed originally to avoid the pain of teething, was a functional device. His attempts on Lois's life were genuine attempts. In the episode Stewie Kills Lois, which aired as a 2-part story in season 6, Stewie actually does appear to kill Lois and then takes over the world, achieving in those 2 episodes the goals he had been pursuing since the pilot. The resolution, which revealed the entire sequence to be a computer simulation Stewie had been running to assess his chances of success, pulled back from the permanence of what had happened, but it did so in a way the show itself acknowledged was unsatisfying. Stewie and Brian, immediately after the simulation ends, directly address the audience's likely reaction to a dream sequence resolution, calling it a middle finger to the fans. The show knew what it was doing. It chose to do it anyway, and in doing so, it effectively closed the door on the version of Stewie who had been genuinely trying to kill his mother and take over the world. The simulation ending in Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie functions, in retrospect, as the show's farewell to evil Stewie, even though it was not announced or framed as such at the time. Stewie's conclusion at the end of those episodes is that his plans of matricide and world domination will have to wait because the simulation showed him that the attempt would end badly for him. That conclusion was presented as a temporary pause. It turned out to be permanent. After those episodes, the matricide plots became increasingly rare and then essentially vanished from the show's regular content. The world domination ambitions followed. Stewie's bedroom still contained weapons in background gags and occasional references, but they were no longer driving storylines the way they had in the early seasons. The change happened in stages rather than all at once, and tracing those stages reveals something interesting about how the show understood its own character over time. The earliest shift was tonal rather than narrative. In the show's original run, Stewie's evil was played straight. His plans were treated as real within the show's world. The comedy came from the contrast between his infant body and his adult ambitions, from the gap between the high chair and the death ray. As the show moved into its revival seasons, beginning with season 4 in 2005, the treatment of Stewie's evil began to shift towards something more self-aware. The plans became slightly more absurdist. The menace became slightly more theatrical. The show began to let Stewie's villainy function more as a character quirk than as a genuine narrative engine. Alongside that tonal shift came the increasing prominence of Stewie Stewie's relationship with Brian. The Road to episodes, which send Brian and Stewie on elaborate adventures together, had existed since the original run, but they became more central to the show's identity in the revival period. Those episodes built a specific dynamic between the two characters, one in which Stewie's intelligence and ambition were channeled into the logistics of whatever adventure the episode required rather than into the original matricide and world domination framework. The Road to episodes gave Stewie something to do that was not killing Lois, and they gave Brian a foil that made both characters more interesting than they were separately. The more that dynamic developed, the less space the original evil Stewie had to operate in. The sexuality question emerged around the same period and became increasingly prominent as the revival seasons progressed. Stewie's sexual identity was something the show circled without landing on throughout its run. Multiple episodes contain jokes suggesting Stewie is gay or bisexual. In Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, he is asked directly if he is queer and replies probably. In Chick Answer, the closing credits contain a moment where Stewie says he could totally get into being gay. In various other episodes, there are references to boyfriends, to gay bars, to romantic feelings toward male characters. The show never confirmed any of this as definitive canon. MacFarlane himself addressed the question in interviews at various points, suggesting that Stewie's sexuality was deliberately kept ambiguous, and that the character had evolved away from the original conception in ways that made a definitive statement on the question complicated. What is notable about the sexuality question in the context of the evil Stewie disappearance is that the two shifts happened simultaneously. As the show moved Stewie away from his original violent, domination-obsessed characterization, it moved him toward a characterization defined more by wit, by his relationship with Brian, and by the ongoing sexual ambiguity jokes. These were not unrelated developments. The original Stewie was a specific kind of character, one whose menace was part of what made him funny, and whose ambitions gave him a gravity that the jokes operated against. The revised Stewie was a different kind of character, one whose humor came from his relationship with Brian, and from the contrast between his sophisticated vocabulary and his infant circumstances. Both versions are recognizably Stewie Griffin, but they are doing fundamentally different things, and the show never explained the transition from one to the other. The fan response to the change was divided, and has remained divided across the decades since it happened. Some viewers found the original evil Stewie repetitive and were glad to see the character develop in new directions. The Brian and Stewie dynamic produced some of the show's most praised episodes, and the argument that the relationship between those two characters was more dramatically rich than Stewie's solo villainy is not without merit. Brian and Stewie, the bottle episode, would not exist in the form it does without the accumulated history of the Road to episodes and the specific dynamic they built between the two characters. That episode is regularly cited as one of the finest things Family Guy has ever produced, and it required a Stewie who was capable of genuine emotional connection rather than a Stewie whose primary relationship with everyone around him was strategic. But other viewers mourned the original version and continued to mourn it long after the transition was complete. Forum discussions and fan community posts from the mid-2000s onward document this division clearly. The argument on the side of the original Stewie was essentially that the show had abandoned something genuinely strange and genuinely its own in favor of something more familiar and easier to write. Evil Stewie was a character who existed nowhere else in animated television. A baby with a functioning time machine and a genuine plan for matricide and global domination played entirely straight was not a template that had been used before. Replacing that with a sharp-tongued infant whose primary narrative function was to be Brian's best friend was, in this reading, a retreat from the most distinctive thing the show had created. The simulation ending in the season 6 two-parter carries a specific detail that is worth returning to in this context. When Stewie and Brian acknowledge that the dream sequence resolution might frustrate viewers, they are doing something that Family Guy does occasionally, and that is usually read as a sign of the show's self-awareness, its willingness to acknowledge its own devices and limitations. But in this case, the self-awareness also functions as a deflection. By naming the problem directly, the show makes it harder to criticize the problem without the criticism being anticipated and absorbed. The show called it a middle finger to the fans before any fan could call it that. That preemptive acknowledgement did not change what the ending actually was, which was the show closing off the original Stewie storyline in a way that preserved the status quo without having to commit to a genuine resolution. Lois survived. Stewie did not take over the world. Everything returned to normal, and evil Stewie quietly stopped being the engine of the show's most ambitious character work. What replaced him was never going to be as strange. That is the honest conclusion of looking at the full arc of Stewie Griffin's evolution across the show's run. The original version version was stranger than what followed. It operated on premises that had no precedent in animated television, and that gave the show a quality of genuine unpredictability. When Stewie was genuinely trying to kill his mother and genuinely building weapons toward that end, the show contained a kind of darkness that it has never quite replicated in any other form. The revised Stewie is funnier in a more conventional sense. He is more emotionally accessible. He is easier to write into a wider range of story situations, but he is not as strange. And the strangeness was the thing that made the original version of the character feel like something the show had invented rather than borrowed. The disappearance happened quietly, without ceremony, without a farewell episode or a formal acknowledgement that the character had changed. Stewie Griffin is still on Family Guy. He is still voiced by Seth MacFarlane. He still lives at 31 Spooner Street in Quahog. He still has a football-shaped head and a British accent. But the version of that character who sat in his high chair and planned the end of everything is gone, and the show never said goodbye to him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stewie's transformation was gradual and happened across many seasons, a slow drift away from what the character originally was. The next mystery is different. It is not about a character changing over time. It is about a question the show introduced in its very first season and then spent more than 2 decades refusing to answer. Section 7. Can anyone actually hear Stewie? There is a question that runs through every single episode of Family Guy from the pilot onward, a question so fundamental to the show's basic architecture that answering it definitively would change how the entire series reads, and yet the show has never answered it. The question is simple to state. It is considerably less simple to resolve. Can the Griffin family hear and understand Stewie when he speaks? It sounds like the kind of question that has an obvious answer. Stewie is a main character. He talks constantly. He delivers elaborate monologues. He participates in conversations. He makes jokes that land within scenes. Surely the answer is yes. The family can hear him, and the show simply operates with the convenient unreality that animated comedies have always permitted themselves, where a talking baby is no more remarkable than a talking dog. But the actual evidence inside the show across its full run is not that clean or that simple. The show gives contradictory answers to this question across different episodes, different seasons, and sometimes within the same episode. Characters respond to Stewie in some moments and appear entirely unable to perceive him in others. The inconsistency is not incidental. It is sustained and patterned enough to suggest that the show is doing something deliberate with the ambiguity, even if what exactly it is doing has never been fully explained by the people who make it. To understand the depth of the inconsistency, it is worth going through specific examples carefully, rather than speaking about it in general terms. In the show's early seasons, the predominant treatment of Stewie's speech is that the adults around him cannot understand it. Peter and Lois in particular react to Stewie the way parents of very young children react to a baby making sounds, with affection and incomprehension rather than with engagement. When Stewie delivers a monologue about his plans to kill Lois while standing directly in front of her, she responds to him in baby talk, cooing at him and interpreting his elaborate threats as the sounds an infant makes. The joke is that Stewie is saying something precise and violent, and that the person he is threatening perceives it as adorable babbling. That reading of the joke requires that Lois genuinely cannot understand what Stewie is saying. If she could hear and understand him, the scene would not work the same way. Her incomprehension is load-bearing. But then there are moments scattered across the show's run where that framework breaks down entirely. Characters respond to things Stewie says in ways that only make sense if they heard and understood what he said. In various episodes, family members or other characters react directly to Stewie's most explicit statements, including statements about violence and about his plans, in ways that suggest they received the content of what he said rather than simply the sound of a baby making noise. These moments are not rare enough to be dismissed as mistakes. They happen too regularly and across too many seasons to be explained as simple continuity errors in a show that was not paying attention to its own internal logic. The show itself acknowledged this inconsistency within the text at least once, in a moment that is notable precisely because of how it handled the acknowledgement. In the episode E, Peter Bus Unum, the family's inability to understand Stewie is referenced as a meta-joke, and the episode's structure briefly comments on its own ambiguity. The fact that the show went to the trouble of making this acknowledgement suggests that the production was aware of the question and had thought about it enough to build a joke around it, even if that joke did not resolve the question. Acknowledging an inconsistency inside a comedy is not the same as explaining it. It is a way of recognizing that the audience has noticed something and signaling that the show has noticed it too, without committing to an answer. Brian is the character whose relationship with Stewie most directly engages with the hearing question, and Brian's Brian's case is where the inconsistency becomes most interesting to examine. Brian can clearly hear and understand Stewie. This is established early and maintained consistently throughout the show's run. The Brian and Stewie dynamic, which becomes one of the show's primary storytelling engines, depends entirely on the two characters being able to communicate with each other. Brian hears what Stewie says, he responds to it. He disagrees with it, is disturbed by it, is amused by it, and is occasionally moved by it. The entire road to series and every bottle episode featuring the two of them is built on the premise that Brian and Stewie exist in genuine dialogue with each other. The question of why Brian can hear Stewie when the rest of the family apparently cannot has generated significant fan discussion over the years and has been the subject of considerable theorizing. One reading that has circulated is that Brian and Stewie can communicate because they occupy a similar position within the show's world. Two characters with adult-level intelligence and emotional complexity who are nevertheless trapped inside bodies that the world around them refuses to take seriously. Brian is a dog in a family of humans. Stewie is an infant in a family of adults. Neither one is fully perceived by the people around them as what they actually are. That shared condition of being misread by their environment creates a connection between them that does not exist between Stewie and anyone else in the Griffin household. That reading is interpretive rather than textual. The show has not confirmed it, but it is consistent with how the two characters are written and how their relationship functions across the show's run. The moments where Brian and Stewie communicate most directly and most honestly tend to be moments where the show is operating at its most emotionally sincere, where it is trying to do something other than generate jokes. The bottle episode Brian and Stewie, where the two are locked in a bank vault, would not be possible if Brian could not hear and understand Stewie. The emotional weight of that episode depends entirely on the premise that these two characters can talk to each other in a way that neither of them can talk to anyone else. The broader Griffin family's relationship with Stewie's speech has another layer of complexity that is worth examining separately from the simple hearing question. Even in episodes where family members appear to understand Stewie's words, they frequently do not respond to the content of what he is saying in the way you would expect. When Stewie makes statements about wanting to kill Lois, the family members who hear him sometimes ignore the statement's content entirely rather than responding to it with the alarm that a child announcing murderous intent would typically generate. This creates a different kind of ambiguity than the simple hearing question. It suggests a possibility that is in some ways stranger than either of the cleanest answers, that some members of the Griffin family can hear Stewie and understand his words, but have developed a way of not processing the content of what he says, because processing it would require a response that the show's format does not want to generate. This reading suggests that the family's apparent incomprehension of Stewie is partly a genuine inability to hear him and partly a kind of willful non-engagement with what they do hear. Peter and Lois are not characters who engage carefully with most things that happen around them. The show's comedy depends on Peter in particular being someone who fails to process information that should require a response. His inability to engage with Stewie's threats might be less about literally not hearing them and more about the general incapacity for careful attention that defines his character. That would mean the question of whether the family can hear Stewie is not a single yes or no answer, but a more complicated set of overlapping situations. Some family members who genuinely cannot hear him, some who hear but do not process, some who process but do not engage, and Brian as the sole exception who both hears and genuinely responds. Seth MacFarlane addressed the hearing question in interviews at various points during the show's run, though his answers were never definitive and shifted somewhat depending on when and where he was asked. In some interviews, he described the family's inability to understand Stewie as an intentional part of the show's original concept. The idea being that Stewie's interiority was meant to be invisible to the people around him, that his elaborate inner life and his violent ambitions were happening in a space that the adult world could not access. In other interviews, he acknowledged that the show had not maintained this concept consistently, and that continuity in this area was not something the production had tracked carefully across the run. That acknowledgement is honest and probably accurate. Family Guy is not a show that has historically prioritized internal consistency across its long run. The floating timeline, the characters who age and do not age, the jobs that change without explanation, the relationships that develop and then reset, all of these features of the show suggest a production that values individual episode effectiveness over the coherence of a sustained fictional world. The Stewie hearing question fits within that broader pattern of deliberate or at least accepted inconsistency. The show did what served each episode it was making rather than what served a unified answer to the question. But the hearing question question is a more fundamental inconsistency than most of the others, because it is not about a detail of plot or character history. It is about the basic premise of how one of the show's most important characters exists in his own world. Whether Stewie can be heard determines what kind of story he is living in. If the family cannot hear him, he is a deeply isolated figure, an intelligence trapped inside a form that the people around him cannot perceive, living a rich and violent inner life that has no outlet except through Brian and through the audience watching at home. That is a genuinely poignant premise underneath all the comedy. It suggests a character who is profoundly alone in a specific and painful way, surrounded by people who are incapable of knowing him. If the family can hear him and simply do not respond to his threats in the way those threats would demand, the story is different and in some ways darker. It means Stewie's announcements of his intentions are heard and ignored, which says something about how the Griffin household processes information and about the specific kind of invisibility that children experience even when they are technically being listened to. That reading gives the hearing joke a considerably more unsettling undertone than the simple baby make sounds comedy suggests. The show has never chose between these possibilities. It has never settled on an answer and maintained it. The inconsistency has run through every season, appearing in some form in episodes across the entire broadcast history, and the production has continued to treat it as a flexible element that can be deployed differently depending on what a given scene requires. Some scenes need Stewie to be heard. Some scenes need him not to be. The show uses whichever version serves the moment and does not concern itself with what that means for the overall picture. What that leaves behind across more than 2 decades of episodes is a character whose fundamental relationship with the world around him is genuinely unresolved. Stewie Griffin is either profoundly alone in a way the show never fully acknowledges, or he is heard and ignored in a way the show never fully examines. Neither of those possibilities is comfortable. Both of them are more interesting than a simple yes or no answer would have been. And the show, whether by intention or by the accumulated effect of 25 years of inconsistent choices, has ended up in a place where both possibilities exist simultaneously inside the same character, unresolved and quietly strained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of whether Stewie can be heard is a mystery the show built into its foundation and never resolved. The next mystery is different in kind. It involves a specific sequence of events across several episodes, a machine that was destroyed and then reappeared, and a plot hole so large that the show itself briefly acknowledged it before moving on as though nothing had happened. Section 8. The time machine that shouldn't exist. There are continuity errors in long-running television shows, and then there are continuity errors that are so structurally significant, so deeply embedded in the logic of what a show was trying to do across multiple episodes, that calling them errors feels like it understates what actually happened. The story of Stewie's time machine across seasons 12 and 13 of Family Guy belongs in the second category. It is not a case of a character's eye color changing between episodes or a house having a different number of rooms in one scene than another. It is a case where the show built an entire emotional arc around the permanent destruction of a device, used that destruction as the engine of one of its most dramatically serious storylines, and then quietly allowed the device to reappear without explanation, without acknowledgement, and without any apparent concern for what its reappearance meant for the logic of everything that had come before. To follow what happened, the sequence needs to be laid out carefully, because the details of the timeline matter, and because the emotional weight of the storyline depends entirely on understanding what was supposed to be permanent and what was supposed to be impossible. Stewie's time machine had existed in the show since season 1. Its origin is part of the show's foundational mythology, the device built by an infant genius to avoid the pain of teething, which is exactly the kind of absurdist premise that defined early Family Guy. Over the course of the show's run, the time machine appeared in dozens of episodes, functioning as a narrative convenience that allowed Brian and Stewie to travel to different historical periods, to alternate timelines, and to the show's own past. It was one of the most frequently used devices in the show's storytelling toolkit, and its presence in Stewie's bedroom was as much a part of the show's established furniture as the Griffin family couch or the drunken clam bar where Peter and his friends spent their evenings. The machine's destruction was not treated casually. It was the result of a deliberate narrative decision made in the season 12 episode Life of Brian, which aired on November 24th, 2013. The episode begins with Stewie and Brian returning from a time travel trip to Jamestown in the 17th century, a trip that went wrong in the ways that their time travel trips frequently went wrong. Stewie, tired of the recurring pattern of their adventures creating problems that required further time travel to fix, makes a decision. He takes the time machine to a junkyard and destroys it. He dismantles it deliberately, with the stated intention of ending the cycle of temporal interference that has repeatedly put him and Brian in danger and repeatedly complicated the show's world in ways that required elaborate resolution. The destruction of the time machine is presented in the episode as a genuine and permanent act. Stewie does not hide it or lock it away. He physically destroys it, and the show immediately demonstrates the weight of that decision by having the episode's next significant event be Brian's death. While Stewie is inside retrieving the street hockey net he and Brian had spotted at the junkyard, Brian is struck by a car in the street. The accident happens fast. Brian is taken to the hospital. His injuries are fatal. The Griffin family gathers to say goodbye. Brian dies. The death of Brian Griffin was treated by the production and by the audience as a major television event. Mila Kunis, Seth Green, and other cast members discussed it publicly. Seth MacFarlane posted on social media about it. A petition was started by fans demanding Brian's return, gathering tens of thousands of signatures in a short period of time. The response was large enough and sustained enough that it was covered as a news story by outlets that did not typically cover Family Guy episode developments in detail. What gave the death its particular emotional impact, beyond the simple loss of a character who had been present since the pilot, was the specific narrative architecture surrounding it. Stewie had destroyed the time machine immediately before Brian died. The mechanism that could have been used to prevent Brian's death was gone. The show had constructed the situation so that the loss was irreversible within the logic it had established. This was not accidental. The episode makes the connection explicit. After Brian dies, Stewie attempts to rebuild the time machine so that he can go back and save his friend. He discovers that he cannot obtain the parts he needs. The supplier who could have provided them is unavailable. Stewie is unable to rebuild the machine. The death stands. Brian is replaced by a new family dog, an Italian accented smooth talker named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico. The Griffin family moves forward without Brian. The show presents this as permanent. The resolution came in the season 12 Christmas episode titled Christmas Guy, which aired on December 15, 2013, 3 weeks after Brian's death. The episode follows Stewie through a Christmas Eve in Quahog that takes a turn when he spots something at the Quahog Mall. He sees a version of himself, a past version from an earlier time travel adventure, who is carrying a time machine return pad. Stewie, in the present, approaches this past version of himself and takes the return pad. He then uses the return pad to travel back to the moment just before Brian was struck by the car and warns Brian to move out of the street. Brian survives. He returns to the Griffin family. Vinny, understanding what has happened and accepting it with grace, disappears from the timeline. The emotional mechanics of Christmas Guy work. The episode was received warmly by audiences who had been upset by Brian's death. The reunion between Brian and Stewie, built around the Christmas holiday and framed as a story about what friendship means and what it is worth, hit the emotional notes it was aiming for. Seth MacFarlane posted about the episode, describing it as a lesson about not taking the people you love for granted, framing the whole arc as an intentional emotional journey with a meaningful destination. But the resolution created a problem that the show did not address and has never fully addressed. The return pad that Stewie used in Christmas Guy to save Brian belonged to a past version of Stewie from a previous time travel adventure. Using that return pad to go back and save Brian was a one-time solution. It did not rebuild the time machine. It did not restore Stewie's ability to travel through time using the device he had destroyed at the junkyard. The mechanics of the resolution were specifically limited in scope. Stewie got Brian back. The time machine was still gone. And then, in subsequent episodes, the time machine began appearing again. Not immediately, and not in every episode, but across the seasons that followed Brian's death and resurrection, Stewie's time travel capabilities gradually re-established themselves in the show's storytelling without any episode explaining how this was possible. The machine that had been destroyed at a junkyard, the destruction of which had been the narrative precondition for one of the show's most emotionally significant storylines, was simply present again. Characters used it. Time travel episodes continued. The show moved forward as though the destruction of the machine in Life of Brian had not permanently changed the conditions of Stewie's world. The show did briefly acknowledge this inconsistency, which is worth noting because it demonstrates that the production was not entirely unaware of the problem. In the episode Chap Stewie, which aired in season 12, Brian notices that the time machine is back and points out that Stewie had sworn off time travel. The acknowledgement is brief and is handled as a passing joke rather than as a genuine engagement with the question of how the machine returns. Stewie's response does not explain where the machine came from or how it was rebuilt. The show notes the inconsistency, gets a small joke out of the acknowledgement, and moves on. It is a more self-aware version of the same move the show made with the Stewie hearing question, recognizing that the audience has noticed something information without providing a genuine answer to what they noticed. The structural problem with this approach is that the destruction of the time machine was not a minor continuity detail. It was the load-bearing element of one of the show's most ambitious dramatic sequences. Brian's death worked as an emotional event precisely because the show had established in the same episode that the mechanism for reversing it was gone. The audience's grief over Brian's death, which was genuine and measurable in the response it generated, was shaped by the understanding that the death was permanent. The Christmas Guy resolution found a narrow and specific way around that permanence through the borrowed return pad, which preserved the logic that the machine itself was destroyed while still allowing Brian to be saved. That was a careful piece of narrative construction. It honored the weight of what the show had established while finding a way to undo it that did not simply erase the rules it had set. The quiet reappearance of the time machine in later seasons undid that careful construction retroactively. If the machine could simply come back without explanation, then its destruction in Life of Brian was not a permanent change to the show's world. It was a temporary plot device, a narrative obstacle that the show placed in its own path for a few episodes before removing it again. That reframing changes the emotional logic of the Brian death arc. The death and the specific circumstances of irreversibility surrounding it loses some of its weight when the irreversibility turns out to have been provisional. The machine's return does not erase what the show built in those episodes. The performances and the writing and the genuine audience response all still exist, but it places a question mark over the permanence that gave the storyline its particular kind of gravity. There is also a broader implication that fans and commentators identified in the wake of the time machine's reappearance. If Stewie has access to time travel again, the question of why he does not use it to address various problems that arise in subsequent episodes becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Time travel in Family Guy has never been governed by strict rules about what can and cannot be changed, but it has functioned as a device powerful enough to alter the course of history, to prevent national tragedies, to reach into the past and undo deaths. A character who possesses that capability and does not deploy it in situations where it would be clearly useful requires some accounting for why he is choosing not to use it. The show does not provide that accounting. The time machine exists when the show needs it for a time travel episode and is otherwise not present in the character's decision-making. That inconsistency is a version of a problem that affects every long-running show that introduces extremely powerful narrative devices. Once a character has access to something that can alter reality, every episode that does not use that device to solve its central problem requires the audience to accept that the character made a choice not to use it. Family Guy has never been a show that asks its audience to track those kinds of choices carefully across episodes. Its format does not require it, and its tone does not support it. But the specific case of the time machine, because it was destroyed in such a deliberate and emotionally significant way, and because its destruction was the narrative precondition for one of the show's most discussed storylines, makes the inconsistency harder to set aside than the show's general continuity looseness would normally allow. What the full arc of the time machine across those seasons reveals is a production that was willing to make bold narrative commitments in individual episodes without fully accounting for what those commitments would mean for the episodes that came after. Life of Brian and Christmas Guy are both strong episodes. They work individually and they work as a paired sequence. The destruction of the time machine and its role in Brian's death is a sophisticated piece of storytelling for a show that is not always interested in sophistication. The subsequent quiet reappearance of the machine is a much less sophisticated piece of storytelling that happens to undercut what came before it. The show built something carefully and then walked away from the careful building without ceremony or acknowledgement. The time machine is still in Stewie's bedroom. It had been used in episodes since Brian's return. Nobody in the show's world has explained where it came from or how it was rebuilt. The junkyard where it was destroyed has not been revisited. The question of how Stewie regained his time travel capabilities sits inside the show's history without an answer, alongside the question of whether the family can hear Stewie, and alongside the question of what happened to evil, Stewie's plans for world domination. These are not identical mysteries, but they share a quality. They are things the show introduced with apparent seriousness and then quietly stopped accounting for, leaving them in place as unresolved elements of a world that the production has never fully committed to making coherent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The time machine disappeared and reappeared without explanation, and the show moved on. The next mystery is about a character who has been present since the pilot, who has never disappeared, and who the show has treated in a way so consistent and so deliberate that it raises a question the production has never never directly answered. Was Meg Griffin designed to be treated the way she is? And if so, what exactly was that design for? Section 9. The Meg question there is a character at the center of Family Guy who is not treated like a character. She lives in the Griffin house. She appears in the opening credits. She has been voiced by the same actress, Mila Kunis, since the second season, after an initial period where she was voiced by Lacey Chabert during the first season's production. She has been present in nearly every episode across more than 2 decades of television. Her name appears in the show's promotional materials. She is, by every formal measure, a main character of one of the longest-running animated series in American television history, and yet the show has spent that entire run treating her as someone who does not fully count, as someone whose feelings are available for jokes in a way that the other characters' feelings are not, as someone the narrative returns to again and again, not to develop or explore, but to dismiss, humiliate, and reset to a condition of baseline misery that the show requires her to occupy so that everything around her can function the way it does. The treatment of Meg Griffin is one of the most sustained and deliberate character choices in Family Guy's history. It is also one of the most uncomfortable to examine at length, because the longer you look at it, the harder it becomes to read it as simply a running gag that the show fell into and never reconsidered. The pattern is too consistent, too pervasive, and too structurally integrated into how the show operates to be accidental. Something specific is happening with Meg, and the show has never fully explained what that something is, even in the where it appears to be on the verge of addressing it directly. To understand the full scope of what is being done to Meg across the show's run, it helps to start with the basics of how she is positioned relative to the other characters. Peter is an idiot, but his idiocy is treated as lovable, and his perspective drives us a significant portion of the show's storylines. Lois is the family's practical center, the person who manages the household and whose intelligence is acknowledged even when it is undercut by her own contradictions. Chris is dim but affectionate, and the show treats his limitations with a gentleness it does not extend to Meg. Stewie and Brian occupy their own elevated tier of the show's comedy, the characters whose interactions drive the most critically praised episodes and who are allowed a range of emotional expression and genuine development that the other characters rarely access. And then there is Meg. Meg is a teenage girl who wants what most teenage characters in American television want. She wants to be liked, she wants romantic relationships, she wants her family to acknowledge her, she wants to be seen as a person rather than as an afterthought. These are not complicated or unusual desires. They are the baseline human desires that make a character sympathetic, and in almost any other show they would be treated as a foundation for genuine storytelling about adolescence, about belonging, about the specific difficulties of growing up in a household defined by chaos and self-absorption. Family Guy uses them as the setup for a joke about how those desires will never be fulfilled, how Meg's wanting will always be met with rejection, and how the rejection is funny precisely because it is so total and so unrelenting. The family's treatment of Meg follows a pattern that the show maintains with remarkable consistency across its run. Peter insults her routinely and without provocation. He forgets she exists in some episodes. He expresses active dislike for her in others. Lois, who presents herself as the family's compassionate center, participates in the dismissal of Meg more than she acknowledges, offering sympathy in some moments, while enabling or contributing to Meg's marginalization in others. Chris, younger than Meg and considerably less intelligent, is still treated by the narrative with more warmth and more genuine affection than his older sister receives. The family's collective relationship with Meg is one of low-grade hostility, punctuated by occasional moments of warmth that are almost always undercut before they can establish themselves as something lasting. The show's most direct engagement with the question of why Meg is treated this way came in the Season 9 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired in October 2011. The episode, set during a hurricane that traps the Griffin family inside their house together, builds toward a confrontation in which Meg finally says directly to her family what the show has been demonstrating about their behavior for years. She calls out Peter's cruelty, Lois's hypocrisy, and the family's collective failure to treat her as a person. The speech is written with genuine force. It lands with weight inside the episode because it is articulating something the audience has been watching for a long time. For a brief period in that episode, Seahorse Seahorse Seashell Party functions as Family Guy's acknowledgement that what it has been doing to Meg is real and harmful and worthy of direct confrontation. And then the episode takes the acknowledgement and reverses it entirely. After Meg's speech causes the family to turn on each other rather than on Meg, Brian explains to Meg what her function in the family actually is. He tells her that she serves as the lightning rod, the person onto whom the family projects its dysfunction so that the rest of them do not have to confront it in each other. Meg absorbs the family's negativity and in doing so allows them to function. Without her in that role, they fall apart. Brian presents this as a kind of tragic dignity, as though Meg's suffering has a purpose that elevates it beyond simple cruelty. And Meg, having heard this explanation, accepts it. She goes back to her family and resumes her position as the person who will be dismissed and humiliated so that everyone else can be comfortable. The episode is remarkable for what it almost does. It comes closer than any other episode of Family Guy to genuinely examining the show's treatment of Meg as a structural feature rather than a running joke. Brian's explanation of Meg's lightning rod function is a piece of actual character analysis dressed as a therapeutic conversation, and it contains something true about how family systems work and about the specific role that designated scapegoats play in keeping dysfunctional dynamics stable. The idea that one family member absorbs the group's toxicity to allow the others to coexist is a recognizable psychological pattern. The episode is not wrong about that. But the episode's conclusion, where Meg accepts this role and returns to it willingly, is where the analysis breaks down into something considerably more troubling. The show uses a legitimate psychological insight about family scapegoating to justify the continuation of a dynamic it has just acknowledged as harmful. Meg is told, in effect, that her suffering serves a purpose, and that the purposefulness of her suffering makes it acceptable. She accepts this framing and chooses to continue suffering so that her family can function. The episode presents this as maturity, as Meg understanding something important about her situation and responding with grace. What it actually is, if you follow the logic carefully, is the show finding a narrative justification for why it does not have to change how it treats its own character. After Seahorse Seashell Party, the treatment of Meg did not change in any sustained way. The episode that came closest to being a genuine reckoning with the Meg question concluded without producing a reckoning. The family continued to dismiss her. Peter continued to insult her. The occasional moments of warmth toward Meg that appeared in individual episodes continued to be reset before they could develop into anything permanent. The show had named the dynamic, explained it, and then continued it unchanged. The naming functioned as a kind of narrative inoculation, making it harder to criticize the dynamic by demonstrating that the show was already aware of it. There are episodes scattered across the show's run that give Meg genuine storylines and genuine emotional development. In some of these episodes, she demonstrates capabilities and qualities that the show's usual treatment of her actively suppresses. She is shown to be a capable musician in some episodes. She develops relationships that appear meaningful. She exhibits a self-awareness about her situation that is sharper than the show usually allows her to express. These episodes are remembered by fans precisely because they are exceptions, because they show a version of Meg that the show is capable of writing when it chooses to, and that it almost immediately abandons when the episode ends. The reset that follows any genuine Meg development is one of the most consistent features of how the character is handled. An episode will give her something, a relationship, an achievement, a moment of genuine recognition from her family, and then the next episode will return her to baseline. The relationship will disappear without explanation. The achievement will not be referenced. The moment of recognition will have left no trace. This is true of all the Griffin children to some extent, in a show with a floating timeline that does not accumulate character development in the way serialized drama does. But it is more total and more consistent with Meg than with Chris, and it is applied with a deliberateness that goes beyond the show's general indifference to continuity. The voice actress history adds another layer to the Meg question that is worth examining. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg during the production of the first season. The character was recast with Mila Kunis beginning with the second season, and Kunis has voiced Meg continuously since then. Kunis has spoken in interviews about the experience of voicing a character who is consistently the target of the show's cruelest jokes, and her observation have been thoughtful and occasionally revealing about how the production understood what it was doing with Meg. She has described the character's treatment as something she found difficult at times, and as something she understood as a deliberate creative choice rather than as carelessness. That framing, that the treatment of Meg is a choice rather than an oversight, is consistent with what the show's internal evidence suggests. Seth MacFarlane and various writers and producers associated with the show have addressed the Meg question in interviews over the years with varying degrees of directness. The most common framing is that Meg's role as the family's punching bag is a satirical comment on how certain family members are scapegoated in dysfunctional households, and that the exaggerated nature of the show's treatment of her is meant to expose the cruelty of that dynamic, rather than simply to perpetuate it. That explanation is coherent as far as it goes. Family Guy is a show built on satire and exaggeration, and reading Meg's treatment as a satirical portrait of how families treat their most vulnerable members is a legitimate reading. But the satire explanation requires the show to maintain some critical distance from the dynamic it is satirizing, and Family Guy's treatment of Meg frequently collapses that distance. In episodes where Peter's cruelty toward Meg is framed as comedy without any counterweight, without any moment that registers the cost of the cruelty or that positions it as something the narrative recognizes as wrong, the satire reading becomes difficult to sustain. Satire requires a perspective from which the thing being satirized is visible as a problem. When the show simply enacts the dynamic without that perspective, it is not satirizing the scapegoating of a family member. It is doing the scapegoating. The Meg question is ultimately unresolved, not because the show has never engaged with it, but because the engagements it has offered have consistently stopped short of the conclusion that genuine engagement would require. Seahorse Seashell Party named the dynamic and justified its continuation. Individual episodes have shown what Meg could be if the show committed to developing her and then reset her to baseline before that development could take hold. The production has offered satirical framing as an explanation for a pattern of treatment that sometimes exceeds what satire can account for. And Meg has remained across more than 2 decades in the position the show placed her in at the beginning, present in every episode, central to almost none of them, treated as someone whose desires and suffering are available as comedy in a way that the other characters are not. What sits underneath all of that, unacknowledged and unaddressed, is the question of what it means for a show to spend 25 years telling an audience through the repeated enactment of a specific dynamic that certain people are funny to dismiss. The answer to that question is not simple, and Family Guy is not the only show that would have to reckon with it. But it is a question that the show's treatment of Meg makes impossible to entirely avoid, and the fact that the show itself has never fully answered it is the most honest thing that can be said about where the Meg question stands. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Meg's situation is a mystery hiding in plain sight, embedded in every episode across the show's entire run. The final section pulls back further to look at the world that contains all of these characters, a world that has been running for more than 25 years, and that, when examined carefully, does not quite hold together in the way a real place would. Section 10. What Quahog is actually hiding there is a city at the center of Family Guy that has existed for more than 25 years of television, and that, by any reasonable measure, should be one of the most thoroughly documented fictional places in American animated history. Quahog, Rhode Island has appeared in hundreds of episodes. It has a news station, a bar, a brewery, a high school, a church, a hospital, a mall, a coastline, and a specific street address at its center, 31 Spooner Street, where the Griffin family has lived since the pilot. It has recurring citizens, recurring institutions, recurring geography. It has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. It has been the site of alien invasions, zombie outbreaks, nuclear threats, and the kind of citywide physical destruction that Peter Griffin and Ernie, the giant chicken, produce whenever their feud escalates into one of its periodic spectacular rampages through the urban landscape. Quahog is, in all of these respects, a place the show has invested enormous effort in populating and returning to across its entire run. And yet Quahog, when you examine it carefully across the full span of the show's history, does not behave like a real place. It does not behave like a consistent fictional place either. It behaves like something stranger and more slippery than either of those things. A setting that the show uses when it needs a setting and ignores when a setting would create inconvenient questions. A world that operates on rules the show has never fully articulated, and that shift depending on what a given episode requires. The inconsistencies in Quahog's existence are not the kind that come from a production failing to pay attention. They are too pervasive and too structural for that explanation. They are the kind that come from a show that made a decision early on, consciously or not, to treat its own world as a flexible instrument rather than as a fixed architecture, and that has been living with the consequences of that decision ever since. The most fundamental of Quahog's hidden strangeness is the one that affects every character who lives there. Time does not work in Quahog the way it works anywhere else. The Griffin children have been teenagers and a baby for more than 25 years of broadcast time. Meg was introduced as a teenage girl in 1999. She is still a teenage girl. Chris was introduced as a younger teenager in 1999. He is still a younger teenager. Stewie was introduced as an infant in 1999. He is still an infant. None of them have aged in any meaningful or permanent way across a span of real time that would, in the actual world, have taken them from childhood through their 30s. This is not unusual for animated television. The floating timeline, in which characters do not age despite the passage of broadcast years, is a convention of the form that goes back to the earliest days of animated sitcoms. The Simpsons operates on the same principle. So does South Park. Audiences understand and accept this convention as part of the contract of watching animated comedy. The show is not committed to realistic chronology, and most viewers do not expect it to be. But Family Guy's relationship with its floating timeline is more complicated than a simple refusal to age its characters. The show regularly references real-world events and real-world time in ways that create specific contradictions with its own internal chronology. Episodes set in identifiable years or containing references to events with known dates create a timeline that does not match the ages or life histories of the characters who are supposedly living through those years. When the show references something that happened in 2015 and treats it as a current event in an episode where Meg is still 17, it is creating a version of time that cannot coexist with the ages of the people living in it. The show is simultaneously committed to a floating timeline for where its characters and to a present tense relationship with the real world around it. And those two commitments are fundamentally incompatible. The result is a world where Meg Griffin has been 17 years old through events spanning more than a quarter century of American history. She was 17 during the early years of reality television. She was 17 during the financial crisis. She was 17 during the Obama administration and the Trump administration and everything that followed. She has been 17 through all of it, attending the same high school, dealing with the same social difficulties, living in the same bedroom. The version of time that Quahog operates in is not a version that has a name or a precedent in the real world. It is a specific kind of fictional time that Family Guy created by accident and then maintained by necessity because aging the characters would require the show to become something structurally different from what it has always been. Peter Griffin's employment history is another of Quahog's hidden structural mysteries, and it is one that the show handles with even less consistency than the time question. Peter is introduced in the pilot as a safety inspector at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, a job that serves as the setting for several early storylines, and that gives the show a specific economic context for the Griffin family's middle-class but financially strained existence. That job disappears at some point in the show's early seasons without a formal transition episode, and Peter becomes an employee of the Pawtucket Brewery, which serves as his primary workplace for much of the show's later run. The brewery job is more flexible as a setting and provides more story possibilities than the toy factory did, which is probably why the change was made. But it was never explained within the show's world. Peter simply stopped working at one place and started working at another, and the narrative treated this as though it had always been the case. The brewery job itself is inconsistent in ways that accumulate across seasons. Peter's role at the brewery shifts depending on what an episode requires. In some episodes, he is a line worker. In others, he appears to have more authority. The brewery's owner, a recurring character named Angela, who was voiced by Carrie Fisher until Fisher's death in 2016, had a relationship with Peter that evolved and reset across multiple episodes in ways that do not form a coherent employment history. Peter has also, across the show's run, been briefly employed in various other capacities as a fisherman, as a pig farmer, as a newspaper owner, as a television executive, and in various other roles that arise for the duration of an episode and then disappear without affecting his primary identity as a brewery employee. Each of these temporary employments is treated as a genuine change in the show's world for as long as it lasts, and then quietly set aside when the episode ends. The physical geography of Quahog is similarly unstable. The city has been substantially destroyed on multiple occasions through events large enough that a real city would require years of recovery and reconstruction. The battles between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken, which began in the season 2 episode Death is a Bitch, with an argument about an expired coupon, and escalated over the following years into city-destroying physical confrontations, have left portions of Quahog in ruins at the end of multiple episodes. Buildings are demolished, streets are torn up, vehicles are destroyed. The scale of the damage in the more elaborate chicken fight sequences is genuinely enormous, the kind of destruction that would be a major news event in a real city, and that would require significant time and resources to address. By the next episode, the damage is always gone. Quahog has been rebuilt between episodes off-screen without acknowledgement. The buildings that were destroyed are standing again. The streets are intact. The city has recovered completely from from events that would take a real municipality years to process. This is again a convention of animated comedy rather than a specific failure of Family Guy. But the scale of the destruction in the chicken fight episodes is large enough that the between-episode recovery becomes noticeable in a way that smaller resets do not. The show has essentially established that Quahog can absorb any amount of physical damage without lasting consequence, which is a version of the same principle that governs its treatment of character development, that nothing that happens in an episode needs to leave a mark on the world that follows it. The giant chicken feud itself is one of Quahog's most sustained and most mysterious ongoing storylines, precisely because it exists entirely outside the show's normal narrative logic. Ernie the giant chicken appeared first in Death is a Bitch in Season 2, handing Peter an expired coupon that Peter did not notice was expired until after he had used it. Peter's response to this discovery was to attack the chicken in the street. The fight escalated into a prolonged, city-damaging battle that ended with what appeared to be the chicken's death. The chicken returned. The fights recurred. The feud became a running element of the show that appears periodically across its entire run, always following the same general structure: an encounter, an escalation, a spectacular extended battle sequence, and an ambiguous conclusion. The feud between Peter and Ernie the giant chicken has never been explained within the show's world. Nobody in Quahog appears to find it remarkable that Peter Griffin periodically engages in catastrophic physical combat with a giant chicken in the middle of the city. The fights are witnessed by other characters in some episodes and by nobody in others. The chicken's ability to survive what appear to be fatal injuries is never accounted for. The chicken's motivations, beyond the initial coupon dispute, are never examined. The feud simply exists as an element of Quahog's reality, recurring without explanation and resolving without permanence until the season 23 episode The Chicken or the Meg, in which Meg decapitates a chicken at his home, apparently ending the feud after more than 2 decades. The ending was as unexplained as the feud itself. The chicken was gone. Meg had ended it. The show moved on. The question of whether Quahog is meant to be understood as a real place at all, or whether it is something more like a stage set that the show's characters inhabit without the set having any existence independent of their performances within it, is one that the show's behavior across its run consistently pushes toward. Real places accumulate. They carry the marks of what has happened in them. Their geography is fixed. Their institutions have histories. The people who live in them change over time. Quahog does none of these things in any consistent way. It is rebuilt between episodes. Its geography shifts when a story requires a different layout. Its institutions appear and disappear. Its citizens age when aging serves a joke and remain unchanged when consistency would interfere with one. What Quahog most closely resembles, when you step back and look at it across the full run of the show, is a dream version of a New England coastal city, a place assembled from the elements a city would have without the structural logic that makes those elements cohere. It has the pieces of a real place without the architecture of one. Characters move through it as though it is real, and the show occasionally commits to treating it as real when a story requires that commitment, but the underlying structure of how Quahog exists across episodes is the structure of a place that has never fully decided what it is. That undecidedness is, in the end, consistent with everything else the show has left unresolved across its run. Whether Stewie can be heard, where the time machine went and how it came back, what happened to evil Stewie's plans for world domination, why Meg is treated the way she is, and what the show believes about that treatment. These are all versions of the same fundamental quality in Family Guy, a show that introduced ideas with apparent seriousness and then lived with them loosely, that built a world carefully enough to be inhabited, but not carefully enough to be fully coherent, and that has spent more than 25 years being one of the most watched and most discussed animated series in American television history without ever fully resolving the questions it raised at its own beginning. Quahog is still there. The Griffin family still lives at 31 Spooner Street. The Drunken Clam is still open. Tom Tucker is still delivering the news on Channel 5. And underneath all of it, running quietly through every episode that has ever aired, are the unresolved mysteries, the abandoned lore, the characters who changed without explanation, and the places that rebuilt themselves overnight, and the questions the show raised and then walked away from without looking back. That is what Quahog is actually hiding. Not a single secret, but the accumulated weight of 25 years of things the show introduced and never finished, sitting in plain sight in every episode, waiting for someone to look at them closely enough to see them for what they are.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.